This is part 3 of .NET Return Test Questions and Answers video series. In this video, we'll discuss how to bind a computed column to a GridView control. One of our YouTube channel subscribers faced this question in a .NET Return test. Let me explain the scenario. Notice that here we've got employees table with serial number, employee code, name, and date of joining columns. We want to display this data within a GridView control, as you can see here. Notice that serial number, employee code, name, and date of joining columns are displayed as it is. In addition to those columns, we also have eligible for gratuity column. Notice that this column is not present in the database table. We need to compute that column and then bind it to the GridView control. And whether an employee is eligible for gratuity or not, that depends on the tenure of the employee. If the employee has completed 5 years or more, then they are eligible for gratuity, otherwise not. And then within the GridView control, wherever we see value as for this eligible for gratuity column, we need to highlight that value with a different color. Notice that here we are highlighting it with yellow color. So let's say I have to achieve this. The first step here is to create the database table, which I have already done, and here is the SQL script that can do it. I'll have the script available on my blog in case you need it. Now let's flip to Visual Studio. So here I have an empty ASP.NET Web Application project. The first thing here is to add the connection string to web.config file. So let's go ahead and include connection strings section. And to speed things up, I have already typed the required connection string. So let's copy and paste it right there. So we are using the sample database. And to this project, let's add a web form. And on this web form, let's drag and drop a GridView control. And let's also set the style attribute here and set font family to Arial. And let's now flip this to the design mode and auto format this GridView control to choose colorful scheme. And now let's write the required code within the code behind file. So we are going to write some ADO.NET code here. So let's bring in the required ADO.NET namespaces. We need system.data, we need system.data.sql client, and we need system.configuration. The first thing to do is we need to read the connection string. So string cs equals configuration manager dot connection strings of, and we need to specify the name of a connection string, which is dbcs. So let's copy and paste that right there. And let's go ahead and create an instance of SQL connection object. And we are going to use the connection string that we have read from the web.config file to create the SQL connection object. Now let's go ahead and create SQL command object. And our SQL command is going to be pretty straightforward, which simply says select star from employees. So let's copy that and pass it as an argument for SQL command constructor. And we also need to specify the connection object on which we want to execute this SQL command. Now let's create a data table object. And the reason why we are creating data table object here is because notice that within the GridView control, we want to compute this column. Now, if we bind directly the table to the GridView control, we only get those 4 columns within the GridView control. Now, what we're going to do is load this data from the database table into a data table, and then based on the data that we have, we are going to compute whether if the employee is eligible for gratuity or not, add it to the data table, and then bind that data table to the GridView control. And we're going to make use of this DateOfJoining column, to check the tenure of the employee. Okay, so let's flip to Visual Studio now. So we want a data table here. Let's call it dta. And notice what columns we want in the GridView control. We want all these columns: serial number, employee code, name, date of joining, and eligible for gratuity. So we need to add those columns first to the data table. So we need to specify the structure of the table. So data table dot columns dot add, and there are several overloaded add methods. I'm going to use this one where we can specify the column name. So the first column here is going to be serial number. And similarly, let's specify the other columns. And to speed things up, I've already typed that code as well. So we need to add columns for the rest of the columns within the GridView control. So let's copy and paste that right here. So we are adding employee code, name, date of joining, and eligible for gratuity. Okay, so we have the data table now. So let's open the connection, and then let's create an instance of SQL data reader. Let's call it RDR and execute the command. Alright, so that should execute the command and should bring back the results. Let's use a while loop here. So while we are reading the data, so when we read each row, we want to create a table row for this data table, and then move the data from data reader into that data table. Okay, so first we need to create an instance of the data row. So let's say data row, let's call it dr equals dt.new row. So now this row is going to have all these columns. Okay, and we're going to populate the values by retrieving them from the reader object. So I'm going to say dr of the first column is serial number. So dr of serial number equals, we are going to get that from RDR, the reader object. RDR of what is the name of the column within the database? It's called serial number without a space. So let's copy that column name and then paste it right there. Okay, similarly we need to populate values for employee code, name, date of joining, and eligible for gratuity. And to speed things up, I have already typed the required code, so let's copy it and paste it right here. So again, if you look at this code, it's very straightforward. Employee code, retrieve it from reader. Similarly, name, retrieve it from reader. And date of joining, retrieve it from reader. Now, this eligible for gratuity, we don't have it in the database table. We need to compute that. Okay, and how are we going to compute that? Depending on date of joining. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do here before we proceed any further is to write a private function which is going to take the hire date of the employee and then compare that with the current date and time and see if the employee has completed 5 years, and then it's going to return SR no string. So to achieve that, let's actually have a private function here which is going to return a string, and let's call it is eligible for gratuity. And to this we are going to pass date time. Let's call it hire date or date of joining. Okay, so now what we're going to do is I'm going to create a variable of type double, and let's call this difference in days. So what we're going to do here is we have the employee's hire date. Now we're going to subtract that from today's date. And how are we going to get today's date? We can use datetime dot now. That should return us today's date. So from that, subtract the hire date. Okay, so when we subtract two dates, what are we going to get in .NET? We get something called time span, and the time span object has got this days property, which is going to give us the difference between today's date and the date a given employee is hired. Okay, so now we are storing that difference in days in this variable, and everyone knows that in a year we have 365 days except for leap year, which has got 366 days. So, and our business rule says if an employee has completed 5 years, then he is eligible for gratuity. So what we're going to do here is a simple if condition. If this difference in days, if that is greater than or equal to 5 into 365 days, which is 5 years, then we want to return yes, else return no. So pretty straightforward code here. Okay, so now we are going to use this function within the page load event. So what we're going to do here is dr of what is the name of the column, eligible for gratuity, and we are going to retrieve date of joining from the reader object and then pass that to this function. So let's call this function here is eligible for gratuity. It expects hire date to be passed in as date time, but this reader is going to return that as an object, so we need to typecast that to date time. Okay, and this method is going to check compare their hire date with today's date, and then it's going to say yes or no. So that's how we're going to retrieve whether if an employee is eligible for gratuity or not. So here we have the data row. The next step is to actually add it to the data table. So we have the data table, so data table dot rows dot add, and we want to add this data row where we have column values. And then while that is done, we can safely close the connection. So connection.close, and then GridView.dataSource equals data table, which is data, and invoke data bind method. Alright, so let's go ahead and run this now. So now within the GridView control, we should also get eligible for gratuity column, and look at that, it says yes and no depending on the tenure. Now if you look at this date of joining here, it is also displaying the time factor. Let's actually get rid of that. So now this date of joining, we need to typecast that to be of type date time, and then let's convert that to short date string. So let's go ahead and run this one more time, and this time we shouldn't have time there. So notice that eligible for gratuity, it says yes or no depending on the tenure. Now the other requirement is we want to highlight those values wherever we see S for this column with a different color. Okay, so let's see how to achieve that. Now we're going to make use of data bound event, row data bound event for this, and to get to that event, go to the properties of the GridView controller, click on the events icon, and there you should see an event called row data bound. Double click on that, it should automatically generate the event handler. So here, when the row is being data bound with the GridView control, that's when we determine the value of that cell, and then we change the background color, and it's very easy to do. So we're going to use the parameter that's coming into this event handler method. Notice that here we have GridView row event arguments object e. So e dot row dot, so this row is going to return us the row that is being bound to the GridView control, and then we can easily retrieve this cell value and check whether if it is yes. If it is yes, then change that cell background color to green. It's as simple as that. So we have the row, so e dot row type. So the first thing is we need to check if the row type is actually data row, because we don't want to be changing colors within the header and footer. In our grid view we don't have a footer, but we don't want to do anything if it's the header row that is being data bound. That's why we have this check here. If it is data row, then what do we want to do? So we want to say e dot row dot, so within the row, which cell is this one? 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So this is the fourth cell. So e dot row dot cells of 4. Okay, if the text within that cell equal to yes, then we want to change the background color of that cell. So I'm going to copy that and then say back color equals system.drawing.color dot whatever color you want. So we want yellow color, and that's what we are specifying here. So now let's go ahead and run this and see if we get the output that we expect. So notice that wherever we have yes, it's highlighted with yellow color. Now, is this the best way to write this code? Maybe not, because here you're using column indexes. It's going to work fine, but then just imagine what's going to happen if somebody is going to add new columns or remove the existing columns from this GridView control, then the application will either crash or it will not work depending on the change that we are doing. Let's say, for example, the business requirement is we don't want to display this employee code anymore within the GridView control. So if that's the case, what we need to do, what's the change that is required, we will simply come here and then comment out that line, employee code. We also will comment this line right here. And then when we run this, notice that the page is going to crash with an index out of range error. That's because we don't have any cell now with index 4. Okay, so when we add new columns or remove the existing ones, if you use or hard code index numbers like this, the application may not work the way you want it to work. Okay, so another way to actually write this code is like this, as you can see here. So again, it's the same condition. We are checking if the row type is data row, which is very similar to what we have here, and then we are using the same parameter which is coming into this event handler, which is e.row.data item. So that property is going to return something called data row view. Okay, so we are using that data row view, and on that there are chain of properties like data view. So we are from data row view, we are going to data view, and then we are going to the actual table that is bound to the GridView control, and then we are checking the column, okay, eligible for gratuity. Okay, so give me this column ordinal, that is the index position of the column within that table. So we are dynamically getting the column index, and then once we have the column index, we are then using that column index. Okay, and then we are comparing the value. Is it yes? If that is the case, then again look at that. Within cells, we are not hard coding the number, we're using the dynamically computed column index. Okay, so if we do it this way, we are not going to have runtime errors like this when new columns are added or when existing ones are deleted. Let's actually look at that in action. So what we're going to do is actually comment this. Let's copy that. So if e.row type equals data row, so that does not change, it's the same line. Now what we're going to do is use the e object, e.row.data item. Now if you look at what this property is returning, it's actually returning an object, but we know it is going to return something called data row view. So let's store it in a variable of type data row view. Let's call it drv. Okay, so we have this data row view. Now what is the next step? After we have the data row view, we need to compute the column index of eligible for gratuity, and the way we do that is by using this chain of properties here. So from the data row view, we go to data view, and then from there we go to table, and then from there we go to the columns within that table, and we specify the name of the column. So the name of the column here is going to be eligible for gratuity. That's what we have specified within the data table. And we want the column ordinal, which is going to return the index position of that column within the data table. So let's call this int, and let's call it column index equals that. Okay, so now we have column index. What we can do is, instead of hard coding numbers like this, we can simply say if drv of, look at this here, we need to specify the column index. So we are going to pass this column index. If drv, whatever value in that column, convert that to string, and if that is equal to yes, then we know what we want to do. We want to change the cell background color. So e.row.cells of, again, instead of hard coding the number like that, we can pass the column index there. So back color equals whatever. Alright, so now when we run this, notice that the lines are still commented. So we're not displaying employee code. So when we run this, it should actually work now. because we are dynamically computing the column index, that is the index of this column eligible for Gratuity. Now let's reintroduce that column. So before we run that, notice that we don't have employee code there. So let's run this one more time. Now look at that, employee code is displayed, but still the application doesn't crash. Eligible for Gratuity column work the way it has to. That's because we are not hard coding column indexes. Instead, we are dynamically computing that. Alright, that's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.